Imagine the country that has captured the imagination of the entire world. You cannot imagine this land without the iron silhouette of the Eiffel Tower watching over Paris, or the artistic, winding steps of Montmartre climbing toward a basilica of white stone. You think of the fairy tale canals of Strasbourg, the lavender fields of Provence turning purple under summer twilight, and the ancient Roman stones still standing after 2,000 years. But tonight, we are not here for the crowds. We are here for the moment the lights dim. We will walk the empty galleries of the Louvre when the guards have gone home, listen to the bells of Notre Dame echo across silent rooftops, stand beneath the iron arches of the Eiffel Tower when Paris sleeps, and wander through vineyards where moonlight touches each grape like a blessing. You will experience it all without leaving your bed. This evening, we are traveling to France. If you are ready to relax, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into sleep. And I would love to know from which part of the world are you listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin. We arrive at Gare du Nord just as the last commuters are leaving. The station's iron and glass ceiling arches overhead like the ribcage of some enormous creature, and the departure boards click and shuffle through their final announcements. Our train waits on platform 7, a sleeper car bound for nowhere in particular, or perhaps everywhere at once. The conductor nods as we step aboard. The compartment smells of old velvet and wood polish. Through the window, Paris spreads outward in every direction, a galaxy of streetlights and illuminated windows. The train begins to move, slowly at first, then gathering a gentle rhythm that matches the beating of a resting heart. We are not racing toward a destination. We are drifting through time itself, and the first stop is already appearing through the mist. We step off the train into the Champ de Mars, and there it stands. The Eiffel Tower rises 1,063 feet into the night sky, its iron lattice glowing with 20,000 light bulbs that flicker on every hour in a 5-minute cascade of golden sparks. But if you let your eyes adjust, if you soften your focus just slightly, you can see past the lights to the iron itself. 18,000 pieces of puddle iron, joined by 2.5 million rivets, each one heated red hot and hammered into place by hand. The wind moves through the openwork design, creating a low hum that sounds almost like breathing. Gustave Eiffel built a small apartment at the very top, 906 feet above the ground, with wooden furniture and oil lamps and Persian rugs. He entertained Thomas Edison there once, and the two men stood at the window looking down at Paris, discussing the future of electricity while the city below them flickered with gaslight. The iron beneath your hand is cold and slightly damp from the night air. From the tower's base, we can see Montmartre rising to the north, a hill crowned with the white dome of Sacré-Cœur. The streets between here and there are emptying now, the last cafes closing their shutters, the waiters stacking chairs on tables and sweeping cigarette butts into the gutter. We begin to walk. The cobblestones are uneven beneath our feet, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the streetlights cast pools of amber light every 30 feet or so. In the 18th century, these same streets were lit by oil lamps that hung from ropes stretched between buildings, and lamplighters would walk the routes each evening with long poles, lighting each wick by hand. The light was softer then, more orange, and the shadows were deeper. If you pause and close your eyes, you can almost hear the lamplighter's footsteps echoing down the narrow lanes, the scrape of his ladder against stone, the small whoosh of flame catching oil. The modern streetlights hum quietly, and somewhere a shutter creaks on its hinge. Montmartre's steps begin at the base of the hill, where street artists pack away their easels and portrait sketches. There are 300 steps in total, divided into sections by small landings where you can pause to catch your breath. The steps are made of stone, each one slightly different in height and depth, shaped by the feet of millions of pilgrims tourists, and locals climbing toward the basilica above. In the 19th century, artists lived in the buildings that line these steps. Their studios had north-facing windows to catch the steady, even light. Vincent van Gogh lived here for a time, in a small room that cost 15 francs a month. Pablo Picasso rented a studio in a ramshackle building called the Bateau Lavoir, a place so drafty that water froze in the wash basin during winter. The artists are gone now, but the light remains the same, that particular quality of Parisian light that seems to hold every color at once. The stone beneath your hand is cool and slightly rough, like old bone. At the top of the steps, Sacré-Cœur waits in silence. The basilica is built from travertine limestone, a pale stone that was quarried in Château Landon, about 50 miles south of Paris. The stone has a peculiar quality. When rain touches it, a chemical reaction occurs that releases calcite, a white mineral that coats the surface and keeps the building perpetually clean. No matter how much pollution drifts through the Paris air, the basilica remains white, as though it were built yesterday instead of being consecrated in 1919. The Romano-Byzantine domes rise like a cluster of enormous eggs, and the bell tower houses a single bell named La Savoyarde, which weighs 19 tons and requires 8 men to ring it. The sound it makes is so deep that you feel it in your chest before you hear it in your ears. Tonight, the bell is silent. The square in front of the basilica is empty except for a few pigeons settling into the eaves. From here, you can see all of Paris spread below like a carpet of light, and the air smells like rain that has not yet fallen. We descend the other side of the hill, leaving the basilica behind, and enter the labyrinth of streets that make up the Montmartre neighborhood. The buildings here are old, their plaster facades painted in shades of cream and pale yellow and dusty rose. Shutters hang at odd angles, some painted green, others blue, a few left to weather into grey. Ivy climbs the walls, reaching toward windows and balconies, and in the darkness, the leaves look black against the stone. These streets are narrow enough that you can stand in the middle and touch both walls at once. In the medieval period, this was intentional. Narrow streets stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter, and they could be blocked easily during times of unrest. The cobblestones here are smaller than the ones near the Eiffel Tower, each about the size of a fist, and they make a particular sound when rain falls on them, a kind of ticking percussion that echoes off the walls. We round a corner and find ourselves at the entrance to a very different kind of Paris, one that exists entirely underground. The catacombs of Paris begin with a spiral staircase that descends 65 feet below street level. The air grows colder with each step, and the smell changes from the exhaust and bread and wine of the surface to something mineral and damp, like the inside of a cave. The walls are carved from limestone, the same stone that built Notre Dame and the Louvre and most of old Paris. For centuries, this stone was quarried from beneath the city, creating a network of tunnels that stretches for nearly 200 miles. In the late 1700s, the city's cemeteries were overflowing. Bodies were buried in mass graves that sometimes collapsed, spilling bones into the streets. The solution was to move the dead underground, into the empty quarry tunnels. Over the course of several years, workers transferred the remains of approximately 6 million people into the catacombs, stacking the bones with a strange kind of artistry. Femurs are arranged in neat rows, creating walls that stretch for yards in every direction. Skulls are placed at intervals, their empty eye sockets watching the darkness. The temperature down here never changes. It remains a constant 57 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer, year after year. There is a section of the catacombs where the bones form a pattern, a kind of Baroque decoration made entirely from human remains. Skulls are arranged in the shape of a cross, surrounded by concentric circles of femurs and tibias. In the flickering light of the torches that once lit these tunnels, the shadows would have danced across the bones, making them seem almost alive. The workers who arranged these patterns were often quarrymen or cemetery workers, people who spent their entire lives in proximity to death. They approached the task with a kind of reverence, treating each bone as though it still belonged to a person with a name and a story. Above our heads, Paris continues its evening. Cars move through streets. Couples walk hand in hand along the Seine. Waiters pour wine in restaurants with red velvet banquettes. But down here, time has stopped. The silence is absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling, each drop taking perhaps 100 years to form. The limestone walls are cool to the touch, and they seem to absorb sound rather than reflect it. We climb back toward the surface, leaving the bones to their eternal darkness, and emerge near the Seine River. The river moves through the center of Paris like a question mark laid on its side, dividing the city into the right bank and the left bank. It is 482 miles long in total, beginning in the Burgundy region and flowing northwest until it reaches the English Channel. But here in Paris, it is only about 330 feet wide, narrow enough that you can see the expressions on the faces of people standing on the opposite bank. 37 bridges cross the river within the city limits, each with its own design and history. The oldest is the Pont Neuf, which, despite its name, the new bridge was completed in 1607. Its stone arches have weathered 400 years of floods and freezes, revolutions and celebrations. Tonight, the river reflects the lights from the buildings on either bank, turning the water into a moving mirror of gold and silver. The current is stronger than it appears, moving at about 4 miles per hour, fast enough to carry a leaf from one end of the city to the other in less than 2 hours. Houseboats line both banks of the Seine, moored to the stone embankments with thick ropes and rusted chains. These are not recreational vessels, but permanent homes, some of them decades old, painted in fading colors and decorated with flower boxes and bicycles chained to the railings. The tradition of living on the Seine dates back centuries, to a time when river workers and fishermen needed to be close to the water. In the 1920s and 30s, artists and writers discovered the houseboats as affordable housing. The boats rocked gently with the river's movement, and the sound of water lapping against the hull became a kind of lullaby. Today, only a few hundred houseboats remain, and their residents form a small, close community. Lights glow in the windows, warm yellow squares against the dark water. You can see the silhouettes of bookshelves and hanging plants, the edge of a table set for dinner. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, dispersing into the night air. The boats creak softly as the river moves beneath them, a sound like old wood remembering. We cross the Pont des Arts, a pedestrian bridge made of iron and wood, and walk toward the Louvre. The museum sits on the right bank like an enormous palace, which is exactly what it used to be. The building began as a fortress in the late 12th century, built by King Philip II to protect Paris from invasion. You can still see remnants of the original fortress in the basement, where stone walls and the base of a defensive tower have been preserved. Over the centuries, the fortress became a palace, and the palace became a museum. The glass pyramid that now marks the entrance was added in 1989, a structure that caused considerable controversy at the time. The pyramid is 71 feet tall and made of 603 rhombus-shaped glass segments supported by a metal framework. At night, it glows from within, a geometric beacon in the center of the courtyard. The juxtaposition of ancient stone and modern glass creates a strange effect, as though two different eras are existing simultaneously in the same space. Inside the Louvre, after the last visitors have left and the galleries have been locked for the night, the silence is profound. The museum holds more than 380,000 objects, though only about 35,000 are on display at any given time. The rest are kept in climate-controlled storage rooms beneath the building, carefully catalogued and preserved. The galleries themselves are vast, room after room connected by hallways and staircases, each filled with paintings and sculptures and artifacts from every corner of the world. The most famous painting, the Mona Lisa, hangs behind bulletproof glass in a room designed specifically to accommodate the crowds that come to see it. But at night, with no one there, you could stand alone before Leonardo da Vinci's work and look into those eyes without distraction. The painting is smaller than most people expect, just 30 inches by 21 inches, painted on a poplar wood panel. The woman's smile is enigmatic, but her eyes are surprisingly direct, as though she is looking at something specific, just behind your left shoulder. The room smells faintly of old varnish and wood. In another wing of the Louvre, the ancient Egyptian collection sleeps in the darkness. Stone sarcophagi stand upright against the walls, their carved faces serene and ageless. Hieroglyphics cover every surface, telling stories in a language that was forgotten for more than 1,000 years before scholars learned to read it again. The Egyptians believed that writing had magical properties, that the act of carving a name into stone could make a person immortal. Many of the artifacts here are more than 3,000 years old, created by hands that turned to dust millennia ago. Yet the objects themselves remain. There is a small limestone sphinx, about 2 feet tall, that once guarded a temple entrance. Its face has been worn smooth by time and touch, but you can still see the suggestion of eyes, a nose, a mouth frozen in an eternal half-smile. The stone is cool and slightly porous, and if you run your fingers across it, you can feel the chisel marks left by the sculptor who shaped it. Outside these walls, traffic moves along the Rue de Rivoli, and the metro rumbles beneath the street. But here, time moves differently. We leave the Louvre through a side exit and walk east along the river toward Notre Dame. The cathedral sits on the Île de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine that has been inhabited since Roman times. The bridge we cross is cold beneath our feet, the iron railings slick with evening moisture. Notre Dame rises from the island like a ship made of stone, its flying buttresses reaching outward like the ribs of some great beast. Construction began in 1163 and continued for nearly 200 years. The cathedral has survived wars, revolutions, and in 2019, a devastating fire that destroyed the roof and spire. The rebuilding continues, but even in its wounded state, the building radiates a kind of patient strength. The facade is covered with hundreds of carved figures, saints, angels, demons, gargoyles, each one unique, each one positioned to tell a specific part of the Christian story. The central rose window is 43 feet in diameter, made of medieval stained glass that turns sunlight into rivers of color. At night, with no light behind it, the window is dark, a great wheel of lead and glass outlined against the sky. Notre Dame's bells hang in the 2 towers that frame the western facade. The largest bell, named Emmanuel, weighs 13 tons and has been ringing since 1686. It requires 8 men pulling ropes to set it in motion, and when it rings, the sound can be heard for miles across Paris. The bell's tone is a deep, resonant E-flat, a note that seems to vibrate in the chest cavity and the bones of the skull. The smaller bells have names too: Marie, Gabriel, and Geneviève, each tuned to a specific pitch so that together they can play melodies. The tradition of naming church bells is ancient, rooted in the belief that bells have souls, that they are not merely instruments, but beings capable of blessing and protection. Before a bell is hung, it is baptized with water and oil, given a name, and assigned godparents who promise to care for it. The ropes that hang down from the bell tower are worn smooth from centuries of hands gripping and pulling, and the tower itself smells of old rope and stone dust and the faint metallic scent of bronze. From Notre Dame, we walk south across another bridge to the left bank, entering the Latin Quarter. This neighborhood takes its name from the language that was spoken here during the Middle Ages, when the University of Paris was founded, and students and professors conducted all their lectures and debates in Latin. The streets are narrower here, more winding, following paths that were laid down long before city planning was invented. The buildings lean slightly toward one another across the streets, their upper floors sometimes close enough to touch. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was common for neighbors to pass items from window to window, a cup of flour, a bowl of soup, without ever going down to street level. The Latin Quarter has always been a place of books and learning. Small bookshops line the streets, their windows filled with old volumes stacked haphazardly. Philosophy next to poetry, next to forgotten novels from the 1930s. The smell of paper and ink drifts through the doorways, mixing with the scent of coffee from cafes that have been serving students for 200 years. We find ourselves at Shakespeare and Company, a bookshop that sits directly across the river from Notre Dame. The current shop was opened in 1951 by an American named George Whitman, but it took its name from an earlier shop run by Sylvia Beach in the 1920s. That first Shakespeare and Company was a gathering place for expatriate writers Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce. Beach published Joyce's Ulysses when no one else would touch it, printing the book in Paris and smuggling copies to America and England, hidden in trunks and suitcases. The current shop maintains the tradition of welcoming writers. There are beds hidden among the bookshelves, and writers traveling through Paris are allowed to sleep there in exchange for working in the shop for a few hours each day and writing a one-page autobiography for the shop's archive. Thousands of these pages are stored upstairs, each one a small window into a life. The shop smells like old paper and pipe smoke, even though no one has smoked there in decades, as though the odor has soaked into the wood and the books themselves. The Seine continues to flow past us as we walk west, moving at its constant, unhurried pace. In the 19th century, the river was used to transport goods into Paris wine from Burgundy, timber from the forests, stone from quarries upstream. Flat-bottomed boats would be loaded until they rode low in the water, then floated downstream with the current. The return journey against the current was accomplished by teams of horses walking along towpaths on the riverbanks, pulling the boats with long ropes. You can still see sections of these towpaths, now converted into pedestrian walkways, where joggers and cyclists move through the early morning and late evening. The walls that line the river are made of large stone blocks, cut and fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. These walls were built in the 19th century during Baron Haussmann's renovation of Paris, an ambitious project that demolished much of the medieval city and replaced it with wide boulevards and uniform buildings. The walls have aged to a soft grey colour, and moss grows in the cracks where moisture collects. We pass beneath the Pont Alexandre III, perhaps the most ornate bridge in Paris. It was built between 1896 and 1900, a gift from Russia to France, named after Tsar Alexander III, who had formed an alliance between the two countries. The bridge is decorated with gilded bronze sculptures, winged horses, cherubs, nymphs, all covered in gold leaf that catches whatever light is available and throws it back twice as bright. The Art Nouveau lamps that line the bridge are supported by smaller cherubs, their chubby bronze hands holding globes of frosted glass. During the day, the bridge is almost overwhelming in its decoration, but at night, with only the lamps lit, it takes on a quieter beauty. The gold becomes softer, more amber than yellow, and the sculptures fade into silhouettes. The bridge is only 350 feet long, single span without any supporting pillars, an engineering achievement that required the arch to be very flat, rising only about 20 feet above the water. When you stand in the center and look upstream or downstream, the bridge seems to hover just above the river, suspended by intention rather than physics. Our train is waiting at a small station near the Musée d'Orsay. We board again, settling into the compartment as the locomotive begins to move, pulling us away from Paris and into the countryside beyond. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks creates a kind of meditation, a repetitive pattern that requires no thought or attention. Through the window, the city lights gradually thin and disappear, replaced by darkness, broken only occasionally by a distant farmhouse or the glow of a small village. The train follows the Seine for a while, the river a dark ribbon beside the tracks, then turns south and west. We are heading toward Versailles, about 12 miles southwest of Paris. The landscape here is flat, agricultural land that has been farmed for centuries. Even in darkness, you can sense the openness, the way the horizon stretches out in all directions. The air that seeps through the window sills is cooler now, carrying the smell of turned earth and grass and the faint sweetness of something blooming. We arrive at Versailles just before midnight. The palace is closed, the gardens empty, but the gates stand open as though expecting us. The palace began as a hunting lodge built by King Louis XIII in 1624, a modest structure in the middle of forest land. His son, Louis XIV, decided to transform the lodge into the largest palace in Europe, a project that took nearly 50 years and employed thousands of workers. The palace has 700 rooms, 67 staircases, and more than 2,000 windows. The Hall of Mirrors alone is 240 feet long, with 17 mirror-clad arches facing 17 windows that look out onto the gardens. Each arch contains 21 mirrors, and in the 17th century, mirrors were so expensive that the Hall of Mirrors represented a significant portion of France's national wealth. At night, with candles burning in every chandelier, the reflections would multiply infinitely, creating the illusion of a space that went on forever. The floor is parquet, intricate patterns of oak and walnut and cherry, polished to a shine that reflects the ceiling frescoes above. The gardens of Versailles cover nearly 2,000 acres, designed by André Lenotre in a style that became known as the French formal garden. Everything is symmetrical, geometric, controlled. Trees are planted in perfectly straight lines, hedges are trimmed into sharp rectangular shapes, and fountains are positioned at exact intervals to create visual rhythm. Lenotre believed that nature should be improved by human intervention, that wild growth was inferior to disciplined design. The garden includes more than 200,000 trees and 210,000 flowers, replanted each season to ensure continuous bloom. There are 50 fountains, fed by a complex system of reservoirs and pumps that was considered a marvel of engineering in the 17th century. At night, with no crowds and no fountains running, the gardens become a maze of shadows and moonlight. The gravel paths crunch softly underfoot, and the hedges create walls that block the wind, making small outdoor rooms that are surprisingly warm despite the late hour. The air smells of boxwood and roses and wet stone. At the far western end of the gardens, there is a cross-shaped canal, nearly 5,000 feet long, surrounded by trees. Louis XIV kept a small fleet of boats on this canal, gondolas imported from Venice, complete with gondoliers who had been recruited from Italy. The king would host evening parties on the water, with musicians playing from the boats and torches reflected in the dark surface of the canal. The gondoliers lived in a small building called Little Venice, constructed near the canal to house them and their families. They were given French citizenship and encouraged to maintain their Venetian traditions. Some of their descendants still live in Versailles today, though the gondolas are gone and the canal is used mostly by ducks and the occasional swan. The water is very still tonight, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it is difficult to tell where the water ends and the air begins. The trees around the canal are chestnuts and elms, planted in rows so dense that during the day they create a tunnel of shade. At night, they are simply darkness against darkness. We walk back toward the palace, following a path that leads through the orangery. This is a building designed to house citrus trees during winter orange, lemon, and lime trees, planted in large wooden boxes that could be moved indoors when frost threatened. The orangery at Versailles is built into a hillside, with large south-facing windows to capture sunlight and thick walls to retain heat. It can hold more than 1,000 trees, each one carefully tended by gardeners who monitor temperature and humidity and soil moisture. The tradition of growing citrus in northern climates dates back to the Renaissance, when oranges were considered exotic luxuries worth extraordinary effort. The trees bloom in spring, filling the orangery with the scent of citrus blossoms, a smell that is somehow both sweet and sharp, floral and clean. In winter, when the trees are brought inside, the building becomes a kind of artificial summer, warm and humid and green, while snow falls outside. Tonight, the trees are outdoors, lined up in their boxes along the terraces, their leaves dark and glossy in the moonlight. The palace chapel rises at the north end of the complex, a building within a building, tall and narrow, with windows that take up most of the wall space. The chapel is dedicated to Saint Louis, the 13th century king who was canonized for his piety and justice. The interior is white marble and gold leaf, columns reaching upward to support a barrel-vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from the life of Christ. The altar is positioned so that the king could attend Mass from a private balcony on the second floor, looking down on the congregation below. This arrangement reinforced the idea that the king was separate from ordinary people, closer to heaven both literally and figuratively. The chapel has extraordinary acoustics. A whisper in one corner can be heard clearly in the opposite corner, and music seems to hang in the air longer than physics would suggest. The organ has 5 keyboards and 4,000 pipes, ranging from tiny tubes the size of pencils to massive pipes that stand 16 feet tall. When the organ plays, you feel the sound in your sternum and your spine, as though your skeleton is resonating in harmony with the music. Tonight, the chapel is silent, and the marble floor is cold enough that you can feel it through the soles of your shoes. We return to the train as the first suggestion of dawn begins to pale the eastern sky. The locomotive pulls away from Versailles, heading northwest toward the coast of Normandy. The landscape changes as we travel, becoming more rolling, with fields divided by hedgerows and small stone walls. These walls were built centuries ago, farmers clearing rocks from their fields and stacking them at the edges to mark boundaries. Over time, earth accumulated between the rocks, and plants took root: hawthorn, blackthorn, wild roses, until the walls became living fences, habitats for birds and small mammals. The train passes through small villages where nothing is moving yet, where shutters are still closed, and the only light comes from a bakery window where someone is already preparing the day's bread. The smell of baking reaches us even through the sealed windows of the train, yeast and flour, and the faint caramel of crust browning in a hot oven. The fields on either side are mostly pasture, dotted with black and white cows that stand motionless in the pre-dawn grey, their breath visible in the cool air. We arrive at the coast as full morning breaks. The cliffs of Etretat rise from the sea, white chalk formations that have been carved by wind and waves into arches and needles. The most famous arch, called Porte de Val, stands about 230 feet tall, with a natural opening large enough to sail a small boat through at high tide. The chalk is soft enough to carve with a knife, but hard enough to stand for thousands of years, a contradiction explained by the way the stone was formed. Millions of years ago, this area was covered by a shallow sea filled with tiny organisms called coccoliths. When these organisms died, their calcium carbonate shells drifted to the sea floor and accumulated in layers hundreds of feet thick. Over millennia, pressure turned the sediment into chalk, and later geological forces lifted the sea floor above the water. The cliff face is marked by horizontal bands of varying whiteness, each representing a different era, a different community of coccoliths living and dying. Seabirds nest in the cracks and ledges: gulls, kittiwakes, razorbills, their calls echoing off the stone. At the base of the cliffs, there is a beach of smooth stones instead of sand. The stones are mostly flint and chalk, rounded by the constant motion of the waves, and they make a distinctive sound when the waves pull back across them. A rattling rush like thousands of tiny drums all playing at once. Flint forms inside chalk as nodules, concentrations of silica that are much harder than the surrounding stone. As the cliff erodes, the flint is released and falls to the beach, where it is slowly worn down by the sea. In prehistoric times, people collected flint from beaches like this and used it to make tools and weapons. A properly struck piece of flint can be sharper than steel, and it holds an edge for a long time. The beach is littered with flint fragments, some white, some black, some with the chalky cortex still attached on one side. The tide is out now, and pools of water remain among the stones, each one a miniature world containing anemones, small crabs, strands of green seaweed moving in the current. We walk along the coastal path toward the town of Bayeux, about 90 miles to the east. The path follows the cliff edge, rising and falling with the landscape, sometimes coming within inches of sheer drops to the sea below. The grass on either side is short and tough, grazed by sheep that wander freely despite the danger. These sheep produce a wool that is particularly fine and soft, valued for making cloth that can withstand the damp sea air without rotting. In the medieval period, wool from Normandy was exported across Europe, traded for spices and silk and precious metals. The sheep themselves seem indifferent to the height and the wind, lying down in small groups or grazing methodically, their jaws moving in that sideways grinding motion that sheep use to break down tough grasses. The path is marked with cairns, small piles of stones left by previous walkers, each one a tiny monument to the human need to mark passage through landscape. The sea below is the English Channel, which the French call La Manche, the sleeve for its narrow shape. Bayeux is a small town built around a cathedral, and within the cathedral complex is a museum housing an artifact that is nearly 1,000 years old. The Bayeux tapestry is not actually a tapestry, but an embroidery, a piece of linen 230 feet long and 20 inches tall, covered with coloured wool thread depicting the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The embroidery was created sometime in the 1070s, probably commissioned by Bishop Odo, the half-brother of William the Conqueror. The linen is divided into panels, each showing a different scene from the story: Harold swearing an oath to William, the construction of the Norman fleet, the Battle of Hastings itself. The figures are surprisingly expressive despite their simplified forms: soldiers dying with arrows in their eyes, horses tumbling in battle, ships crossing the channel with striped sails billowing. The wool has faded over the centuries, from bright primary colours to softer, earthier tones: rust, olive, butter yellow, faded blue. The embroidery has survived fires, wars, and multiple attempts by various groups to either destroy it or steal it. It was nearly cut up to make wagon covers during the French Revolution. The thread used in the Bayeux embroidery is wool dyed with natural substances: plants, minerals, insects. Red came from madder root, a plant that produces a chemical compound called alizarin when processed. Blue came from woad, a plant that grows wild across northern Europe and produces a blue dye when its leaves are crushed and fermented. Yellow came from weld or dyer's broom, plants that contain luteolin, a pigment that binds to wool fibers and resists fading. The act of dyeing wool in the 11th century was both craft and chemistry, requiring exact temperatures and timing, and the addition of mordant substances like alum or iron that help the dye bond to the fiber. The women who created the Bayeux embroidery would have spent months or years on the work, sitting in chambers lit by oil lamps or candles, their fingers moving in repetitive motions: thread through fabric, pull tight, thread through fabric, pull tight, until the images emerged from the blank linen. The linen itself was woven from flax, a plant that was grown specifically for making fabric. its long fibers strong enough to last centuries if protected from moisture and light. We leave Bayeux and travel east toward Reims, entering the Champagne region where the landscape becomes defined by vineyards. The vines are planted in rows that follow the contours of the hills, and even in darkness, you can see the pattern they make, lines of darker shadow against the lighter ground. Champagne is made from grapes primarily Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier that are grown in chalky soil very similar to the cliffs at Étretat. The chalk provides excellent drainage and reflects sunlight back onto the grapes, helping them ripen in this northern climate, where summers are short and cool. The grapes are harvested in autumn and pressed immediately, and the juice is fermented once to create a still wine. Then the wine is bottled with added yeast and sugar, and the bottles are stored in cellars to ferment a second time. This second fermentation produces carbon dioxide, which dissolves into the wine and creates the bubbles that define champagne. The process was refined over centuries, with each generation of winemakers adding their own improvements and techniques. The cellars beneath Reims are dug into the same chalk that formed the coastal cliffs, tunnels, and chambers extending for miles beneath the city. Some of these cellars were originally Roman chalk quarries, excavated 2,000 years ago to build the city above. The chalk is soft enough to carve with hand tools, but stable enough to create large underground rooms without risking collapse. The temperature in the cellars remains constant at around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, and the humidity is naturally high. Perfect conditions for aging wine. The largest champagne houses Veuve Clicquot, Moet and Chandon, Taittinger each have their own network of cellars, some containing millions of bottles stacked in rows that disappear into darkness beyond the reach of any light. The bottles are stored at an angle, necks tilted downward, and every few weeks, workers called riddlers rotate each bottle a quarter turn and increase the tilt slightly. This process, called riddling, encourages the dead yeast cells to settle in the neck of the bottle, where they can be removed before the final cork is inserted. A skilled riddler can turn 30,000 bottles per day. Above the cellars, the Cathedral of Reims rises in Gothic splendor, its western facade covered with thousands of carved figures. This cathedral was the traditional site for the coronation of French kings, and over the course of 10 centuries, 33 kings were crowned here. The ceremony always followed the same pattern. The king would enter through the western portal, walk the length of the nave to the altar, and there receive the crown and the holy anointing oil that transformed him from a man into a monarch. The oil was kept in a special vessel called the Holy Ampulla, said to have been brought from heaven by a dove during the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, in 496. The cathedral's stained glass windows are among the finest in France, particularly the North Rose window, which is more than 40 feet in diameter and contains glass dating from the 13th century. The blue in these windows is a particular shade called Chartres blue, made using cobalt oxide, and it has a depth that later glassmakers never quite managed to reproduce. Light filtered through this blue takes on an almost liquid quality, filling the cathedral with shifting patterns of color. We continue east, following the train through forests of oak and beech, trees that grow so close together that their canopies create a nearly solid ceiling. These forests cover the hills and valleys of the Vosges Mountains, a range that forms the western edge of the Rhine Valley. The trees are old, some of them planted 200 years ago as part of forestry programs designed to provide timber for shipbuilding and construction. Oak grows slowly, adding perhaps half an inch to its diameter each year, but the wood is extremely dense and durable, resistant to rot and insects. Beech trees grow more quickly and produce a fine-grained wood that is excellent for furniture and tool handles. In autumn, these forests turn colors. The oak leaves bronze, the beech leaves gold, and the floor becomes covered with acorns and beech nuts that feed wild boar, deer, and hundreds of species of birds. Tonight, The forest is dark and quiet, except for the sounds of nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush and the occasional call of an owl hunting from a high branch. We arrive in Strasbourg just as rain begins to fall, a light, steady drizzle that makes the cobblestones slick and reflective. The city sits on the Rhine River, right at the border between France and Germany, and its architecture reflects both cultures: half-timbered houses with steep roofs and elaborately carved wooden facades painted in shades of red and ochre and cream. The old city centre is built on an island in the river, surrounded by water and connected to the mainland by multiple bridges. The streets here are narrow and winding, following the medieval layout that predates any attempt at city planning. Houses lean toward one another, their upper floors jutting out over the street, supported by wooden beams. In the medieval period, this design had a practical purpose. It increased the living space on upper floors without requiring more ground-level property, which was taxed based on street frontage. The overhangs also provided some protection from rain for people walking below. Water runs down the streets in the gutters, carrying fallen leaves and bits of paper toward the storm drains. The Strasbourg Cathedral dominates the city centre, its single spire rising 466 feet into the rainy sky. For more than 200 years, from 1647 until 1874, this was the tallest building in the world. The cathedral is built from pink sandstone quarried from the Vosges Mountains, a stone that takes on different colours depending on the light, sometimes rose, sometimes orange, sometimes deep red. The facade is incredibly detailed, every square inch carved with figures, foliage, animals, geometric patterns. There are hundreds of gargoyles serving as waterspouts, their mouths open to channel rain away from the walls. During a heavy rain, water pours from all of them at once, creating dozens of small waterfalls that splash onto the pavement below. The cathedral has an astronomical clock that was built in the 1840s, a mechanical marvel that displays the positions of the planets, the phases of the moon, and the dates of movable religious holidays. At noon each day, automated figures parade across the clock face, the apostles appearing before Christ, a rooster crowing to mark the hour. The streets around the cathedral are lined with cafes and wine bars, their windows glowing with warm light against the grey evening. Alsatian wine is served here, white wines made from grapes like Riesling and Gewürztraminer that thrive in the region's climate. The Rhine Valley creates a rain shadow effect. The Vosges Mountains block moisture coming from the west, making the valley one of the driest areas in France. This dryness, combined with long sunny days in summer, produces grapes with concentrated flavors. Riesling from Alsace has a mineral quality, a taste that sommeliers describe as flinty or stony, as though the chalk and granite from the soil have somehow transferred into the liquid. The wine is served in green bottles with long, slender necks, and the glass catches the light from candles and table lamps, glowing pale gold. Outside, rain continues to fall on the cobblestones, and the sound is like whispered conversation, constant and gentle. We walk through the Petite France neighbourhood, the oldest and most picturesque section of Strasbourg. The name comes from a hospital that once stood here, built in the 15th century to quarantine soldiers returning from Italian campaigns with syphilis, which at the time was called the French disease everywhere except in France. The hospital is gone now, but the name remains. The houses here are 4 and 5 stories tall, built directly against one another with no space between, creating continuous walls along the narrow streets and canals. The ground floors are stone, but the upper floors are timber frames filled with plaster painted white, creating patterns of dark wood against pale walls. Many of the houses have flower boxes beneath the windows, and even this late in the year, a few hardy geraniums still bloom, their red petals vivid against the white plaster. The canals that run through Petite France are narrow, perhaps 20 feet across, lined with stone walls that are slick with moss, where the water level rises and falls with the river. Barrage Vauban, a covered bridge and dam, stretches across the river at the western edge of Petite France. It was built in the 17th century by a military engineer named Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, who designed fortifications all across France. The dam serves a defensive purpose in case of attack. Sluice gates could be opened to flood the land south of the city, making it impassable for invading armies. The bridge portion has a covered walkway with windows on both sides, and the roof is decorated with terracotta tiles arranged in patterns of green and yellow and orange. Inside, the walkway is lined with sculptures, ancient Roman artifacts, medieval carvings, fragments of buildings that no longer exist. The floor is uneven, worn down by centuries of footsteps, and it creaks slightly as you walk across it. Through the windows, you can see the water flowing beneath the bridge, dark and swift, carrying leaves and small branches downstream. The sound of the water is constant, a low rushing that drowns out all other noise. The train waits for us at the Strasbourg station, steam rising from beneath the carriages into the cold night air. We board and settle in as the locomotive pulls away, heading south and west toward the vineyards and villages of Burgundy. The landscape here is gentler than Alsace, with rolling hills covered in grapevines that are just visible as darker patches against the darkness. Burgundy has been producing wine since Roman times, when soldiers planted vines along the trade routes to ensure a steady supply of wine for the legions. The monks who lived in the region during the Middle Ages refined the winemaking process, experimenting with different grape varieties and fermentation techniques. They discovered that the same grape grown in soil just a few feet away from another vine could produce wine with a completely different character, and they began mapping the vineyards with obsessive precision, dividing them into tiny parcels called climates. There are more than 1,000 climates in Burgundy, each with its own name and reputation. Some are only a few acres in size. We stop at Beaune, a town surrounded by medieval walls and dominated by the Hospices de Beaune, a hospital built in 1443 by Nicolas Rolin, the Chancellor of Burgundy. The hospital was designed to care for the poor, and it continued to function as a working hospital until 1971. The building is most famous for its roof, covered in glazed tiles arranged in geometric patterns of green, yellow, red, and black. The tiles are diamond-shaped, and they catch the light in different ways depending on the angle, creating a surface that seems to shimmer. Inside, the main hall is called the Pauper's Ward, a long room with a barrel-vaulted ceiling painted in rich colors and decorated with carved wooden details. The patients' beds were arranged in alcoves along the walls, each one with curtains that could be drawn for privacy. At the far end of the hall, there is an altar, positioned so that patients could see the service from their beds. The floor is made of glazed tiles, easy to clean, and the walls are whitewashed to reflect as much light as possible. The room has extraordinary acoustics, whispers carry from one end to the other. The Hospices de Beaune owns vineyards throughout the region, donated over the centuries by wealthy patrons. Each autumn, the hospital holds a wine auction, selling barrels of the year's vintage to raise money for charity. The auction has become famous, and wine buyers from around the world attend, bidding on wines that are still aging in oak barrels and will not be bottled for months or years. The prices paid at this auction often set the market price for Burgundy wines for the entire year. The barrels are stored in cellars beneath the hospital, cool rooms carved from limestone, the same stone that forms the foundation of the building above. The oak for the barrels comes from forests in central France, trees that are at least 150 years old before they are harvested. The wood is split along the grain, never sawed, to preserve the natural structure of the fibers, then aged outdoors for 2 to 3 years before being shaped into barrels. A properly made oak barrel will last for decades, and it imparts subtle flavors to the wine: vanilla, toast, spice, that vary depending on how heavily the inside of the barrel was charred during construction. From Beaune, we travel west toward the Loire Valley, the landscape gradually flattening as we approach the river. The Loire is the longest river in France, stretching 629 miles from the mountains of the southeast to the Atlantic coast. It flows through the heart of the country, and throughout history, it served as a major transportation route, connecting the interior to the sea. The river is wide and shallow in many places, with sandbars and islands that shift position with each flood. In the 18th and 19th centuries, flat-bottomed boats called tous cabinets were used to transport goods downstream. Wine, grain, timber and teams of horses or oxen would pull the empty boats back upstream along towpaths. The Loire Valley is famous for its chateaux, massive stone buildings constructed by French nobility during the Renaissance. There are more than 300 chateaux in the valley, ranging from fortified castles to elegant country houses, each one reflecting the ambitions and aesthetics of its builder. We arrive at Chateau de Chambord just as the moon rises, illuminating the building's elaborate roofline. Chambord is the largest chateau in the Loire Valley, with 440 rooms, 84 staircases, and a roof that is almost as complex as the building beneath it. The roof is covered with hundreds of chimneys, turrets, and dormers, each one decorated with carved stone details that cast intricate shadows in the moonlight. The chateau was built for King Francis I, beginning in 1519, and it was designed as a hunting lodge, though calling it a lodge is like calling Versailles a cottage. The central feature is a double helix staircase, a spiral staircase with two separate staircases that wind around the same central axis without ever meeting. The design is often attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, who was living in France at the time, though there is no definitive proof. The staircase allows two people to climb simultaneously, one on each helix, and they can see each other through the openings in the central column, but they never pass. The stone steps are worn smooth in the center from centuries of footsteps. The grounds around Chambord are enclosed by a wall that stretches for 20 miles, creating a hunting park that is larger than the entire city of Paris. The park contains forests of oak and pine, meadows where red deer and wild boar graze, and small ponds where herons stand motionless in the shallows waiting for fish. Francis I would hunt here with his courtiers, sometimes spending weeks at the chateau, rising before dawn to ride through the forest with dogs and hawks. The hunts were elaborate affairs, governed by strict rules about who could pursue which animals and what weapons could be used. Deer were chased on horseback until they were exhausted, then killed with a sword or a spear. Boar were considered dangerous and were hunted with specialized dogs bred for their courage and tenacity. The meat from these hunts would be served at enormous banquets, roasted whole and carried to the table on silver platters, garnished with fruits and herbs and accompanied by wine from the royal cellars. The dining hall at Chambord could seat hundreds of people. We leave Chambord and travel downstream along the Loire to Château de Chenonceau, a building that spans the river itself. The chateau was built in the early 16th century on the foundations of an old mill, and later a two-story gallery was added, stretching across the river on a series of arches. The gallery is 60 feet long, with black and white checkered floors and windows on both sides, overlooking the water. During the Renaissance, the chateau was owned by a series of powerful women: Diane de Poitiers, Catherine de Medici, Louise of Lorraine, each of whom left their mark on the building and gardens. Diane de Poitiers designed the gardens on the north bank, geometric beds filled with roses and lavender and medicinal herbs. Catherine de Medici, when she took over the chateau after Diane's death, created a second garden on the south bank, even more elaborate than the first. The gardens are separated from the wild riverbanks by stone walls, creating controlled spaces of beauty surrounded by untamed nature. At night, the chateau is reflected in the river, a mirror image that is almost more detailed than the building itself. The river beneath Chenonceau flows at a gentle pace, perhaps 2 miles per hour, and the water is relatively shallow, averaging about 6 feet deep. The Loire has always been a temperamental river, prone to flooding in spring when snowmelt from the mountains combines with heavy rain. During major floods, the water level can rise 20 feet or more, submerging the lower arches of Chenonceau and filling the ground floor rooms with water. The chateau has survived these floods for 500 years, the stone arches flexing slightly with the pressure but never breaking. In summer, when water levels drop, sandbars emerge in the middle of the river, small islands of sand and gravel that last for a few weeks before the autumn rains wash them away. Birds nest on these temporary islands' terns, sandpipers, plovers raising their chicks in the brief window when the sand is above water. The riverbanks are lined with willow trees that grow with their roots in the water, their long trailing branches creating curtains of green that sway in the current. We continue west, following the Loire toward the Atlantic coast, passing through the city of Nantes, where the river becomes tidal, its flow reversing twice a day as the ocean pushes salt water upstream. The train turns south, leaving the Loire behind and crossing into Brittany, a region that juts out into the Atlantic like a question mark or a finger pointing toward the Americas. The landscape here is different from the rest of France, harder, rockier, with outcroppings of granite pushing through the thin soil. The coastline is jagged, cut by hundreds of small bays and inlets, and the tides are extreme, sometimes rising and falling by 40 feet in a single cycle. When the tide goes out, it reveals vast stretches of seabed, acres of sand and rock pools and seaweed, and people walk out onto the exposed flats to gather clams and mussels and oysters. The Breton language, which is still spoken by some residents, is more closely related to Welsh and Cornish than to French, a reminder that this region has always been slightly separate from the rest of the country. Near the town of Carnac, thousands of standing stones rise from the fields in long parallel rows. These megaliths were erected during the Neolithic period, between 4000 and 3000 BCE, making them older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Egypt. No one knows for certain why they were placed here or what purpose they served. Some archaeologists believe they were part of an astronomical observatory, markers that aligned with the rising and setting of the sun and moon at specific times of the year. Others think they were territorial markers, boundaries between different tribal groups, or perhaps they had a religious significance that we can no longer understand. The stones are made of local granite, each one weighing several tons, and they were somehow moved into position without the benefit of metal tools or wheeled vehicles. The tallest stone stands about 13 feet high, while the smallest are only a few feet tall, and they are arranged in rows that stretch for more than 2 miles. The fields around the stones are used for grazing sheep, and the animals move among the ancient markers without any apparent concern for their historical significance. The granite is covered with lichens pale grey, bright orange, deep green organisms that grow extremely slowly, adding perhaps a millimeter of growth per decade. The train carries us south along the western coast of France, the Atlantic visible through the window as a dark expanse broken occasionally by the white flash of waves. We arrive at Gironde, a medieval walled town surrounded by salt marshes that have been worked continuously for more than 1,000 years. The marshes are divided into shallow basins called oilets, each about 30 feet square and only a few inches deep. Seawater is channeled from the ocean through a series of canals and allowed to flow slowly through the basins. As the water evaporates under sun and wind, the salt concentration increases until crystals begin to form. The salt is harvested by hand, using wooden tools, raked into small piles, and left to dry before being collected. The work is done in summer when evaporation is fastest, and it requires constant attention. Too much rain will dilute the brine, too little sun will slow the crystallization. The salt that forms on the surface of the water is called fleur de sel, flower of salt, and it has a delicate texture and a slightly different mineral composition than the salt that settles to the bottom. The marshes are home to numerous birds' avocets, stilts, egrets that feed on the small organisms that live in the hypersaline water. The walls around Gironde were built in the 14th and 15th centuries, a defensive fortification with 4 gates and 15 towers. The walls are made of granite blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, fitted together without mortar in some sections. Walking along the ramparts, you can see the entire town laid out below narrow streets radiating from a central square, houses with slate roofs, gardens hidden behind high walls. The gates were designed to be closed and defended in case of attack, with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands and murder holes in the ceilings above the entrance passages, where defenders could drop stones or boiling oil on anyone trying to force their way through. The town itself has barely changed in 500 years. The houses are built of the same granite as the walls, with thick walls that keep the interior cool in summer and retain heat in winter. Many have salt storage lofts in their attics, spaces where harvested salt was kept dry until it could be sold or traded. The salt trade made Gironde wealthy during the Middle Ages, and that wealth is visible in the architecture: carved doorways, decorative windows, houses larger than strictly necessary. We travel inland, leaving the coast behind, crossing the massive Central, a highland region of extinct volcanoes and deep river valleys. The landscape here is ancient, the mountains worn down by erosion from sharp peaks to rounded domes. The volcanic activity ended millions of years ago, but the evidence remains in the form of basalt columns, hot springs, and crater lakes. The train climbs steadily, following a route that was carved through the mountains in the 19th century, when railways were first being built. The engineering required was extraordinary tunnels blasted through solid rock, bridges spanning chasms hundreds of feet deep, viaducts carrying the tracks across valleys. In some places, the railway clings to the side of cliffs, and looking out the window, there is nothing beneath but empty air, and far below, a river reduced to a silver thread by distance. The forests here are mostly chestnut and oak, and in autumn, wild boar feed on the fallen nuts, growing fat before winter. The nights are cold in the massive Central, cold enough that frost forms on the windows of the train, delicate patterns of ice crystals that melt when you touch them. We descend into the Dordogne Valley as dawn approaches, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to the particular shade of grey that suggests rain. The Dordogne River cuts through limestone cliffs, creating a landscape of caves and overhangs and natural rock shelters. Humans have lived in this valley for tens of thousands of years, and they left behind evidence in the form of cave paintings. The most famous of these is at Lascaux, discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers, and a dog exploring a hole left by a fallen tree. The cave contains more than 600 paintings and nearly 1,500 engravings, images of horses, cattle, deer, and other animals painted in ochre, manganese dioxide, and charcoal. The artists used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their subjects 3-dimensional form, placing a horse's shoulder on a bulge of rock, or positioning a bull's back along a curving surface so that the animal seems to move in flickering firelight. The paintings are between 17,000 and 20,000 years old, created during the last ice age, when the climate was much colder and the valley supported herds of now extinct animals. The pigments used in the Lascaux paintings were made from materials gathered locally. Ochre, which produces shades of yellow, orange, and red, is a type of clay containing iron oxide. The iron content determines the color. More iron creates deeper reds, less iron produces yellows. Manganese dioxide creates black and brown tones, and charcoal from burned wood produces a softer, warmer black. The artists ground these materials into powder using stone mortars, then mixed them with water or animal fat to create paint. They applied the paint using fingers, brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, and blow painting techniques, where paint was sprayed from the mouth through hollow bones. Some of the paintings are 20 feet above the current cave floor, suggesting that the artists worked from scaffolding or that the floor level was higher when the paintings were created. The original Lascaux cave is now closed to protect the paintings from damage caused by carbon dioxide from visitors' breath and by algae and fungi that thrive in the presence of humans. A replica cave has been built nearby, recreating the paintings with such precision that even the texture of the rock walls has been duplicated. We continue southwest toward Rocamadour, a village built into a cliff face above the Alzou River Canyon. The buildings cling to the rock in layers, houses at the lowest level, then a series of churches and chapels, and at the very top, a chateau perched on the cliff edge. The entire vertical arrangement spans about 500 feet from the river to the chateau, and to reach the upper levels, visitors must climb 216 steps, called the Grand Escalier. Pilgrims have been climbing these steps for more than 1,000 years, many on their knees, seeking the blessing of the Black Madonna, a wooden statue that resides in the chapel midway up the cliff. The statue is carved from walnut wood and dates to the 12th century, though legend claims it was carved by Saint Amador himself, who may or may not have been the biblical Zacchaeus, the tax collector who climbed a tree to see Jesus. The statue's dark color comes partly from the wood itself, and partly from centuries of candle smoke that have stained the surface. The chapel is small, barely large enough for a dozen people, and it is lit by hundreds of candles left by pilgrims, their flames creating a shifting pattern of light and shadow on the stone walls. Above Rocamadour, the Course, a limestone plateau, stretches in all directions, a landscape of sparse vegetation and exposed rock. The limestone is full of cracks and fissures that drain rainwater quickly into underground rivers, leaving the surface dry even after heavy storms. This type of terrain is called karst, and it creates a unique ecosystem where plants must be drought-tolerant despite relatively high rainfall. Juniper bushes and wild thyme grow in the cracks between rocks, and in spring, the plateau blooms with wildflowers, purple orchids, yellow rock roses, white narcissus. Sheep graze here, small hardy animals that can survive on the tough grasses and herbs. Their milk is used to make Roquefort cheese, a blue-veined cheese that is aged in caves beneath the nearby village of Roquefort-sur-Soulzon. The caves provide perfect conditions for the Penicillium roqueforti mold that gives the cheese its characteristic flavor and appearance. Constant temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit, high humidity, and natural ventilation through cracks in the rock that allow air to circulate. The cheese is aged for a minimum of 3 months, during which time the mold spreads through the veins and cracks that are created by piercing the cheese with long needles. The train descends from the Causse toward Toulouse, the 4th largest city in France, built where the Garonne River makes a wide bend toward the north. Toulouse is called the Pink City because of its brick architecture, buildings constructed from clay bricks that range in color from pale terracotta to deep rose, depending on the light and the age of the brick. Brick was used instead of stone because the surrounding area lacks good building stone, but the clay in the Garonne River Valley is excellent for brickmaking. The bricks are fired in kilns heated by wood or coal, and the firing process determines their final color. Lower temperatures produce lighter colors, higher temperatures create deeper reds. The city's most famous building is the Basilica of Saint-Sernin, the largest Romanesque church still standing in Europe. It was built between the 11th and 13th centuries as a pilgrimage church on the route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The basilica can hold 1,000 people and its bell tower rises 210 feet, visible from miles away across the flat surrounding plains. Inside Saint-Sernin, the nave is dimly lit, with light entering through small windows set high in the walls. The interior smells of stone and old incense and candle wax, scents that have accumulated over 900 years. The church was designed with acoustics in mind. Gregorian chants sung in the choir are audible throughout the entire building, the stone walls and barrel-vaulted ceiling reflecting and amplifying the sound. The floor is made of brick, laid in herringbone patterns, and worn smooth in places where pilgrims have walked for centuries. The crypt beneath the church holds relics of Saint Saturninus, the first bishop of Toulouse, who was martyred in the 3rd century by being tied to a bull that dragged him through the streets until he died. The crypt is cool and dark, lit only by candles, and the air has a different quality than the air in the church above, denser somehow, as though weighted by the passage of time. The walls are carved with simple crosses, and the names of medieval pilgrims scratched into the soft brick with knives or the points of walking staffs. From Toulouse, we travel south toward the Pyrenees, mountains that form a natural border between France and Spain. The train follows the valleys that cut into the mountains, climbing gradually until the landscape becomes dominated by peaks and glaciers and alpine meadows. We stop at Lourdes, a small town that became famous in 1858 when a 14-year-old girl named Bernadette Suberus reported seeing visions of the Virgin Mary in a grotto near the river. The Catholic Church investigated the claims and eventually declared the visions authentic, and Lourdes became one of the major pilgrimage sites in the world. The grotto, where Bernadette saw her visions, is now enclosed in a chapel complex that includes multiple churches, hospitals, and facilities for processing the thousands of pilgrims who arrive every day. The grotto itself is a natural cave in a limestone cliff, with a spring that emerges from the rock at the back. Bernadette reported that the vision told her to dig in a specific spot, and when she did, water began to flow from the ground. This water is considered holy by many, and people come from around the world to bathe in it or take it home in bottles. The Pyrenees rise behind Lourdes, mountains that reach elevations of more than 11,000 feet. These mountains are older than the Alps, but younger than the Massif Central, formed by the collision of the Iberian tectonic plate with the Eurasian plate beginning about 50 million years ago. The highest peak, Pic de Aneto, sits just on the Spanish side of the border, at 11,168 feet. The French side of the range is characterized by steep valleys and cirques bowl-shaped depressions carved by glaciers during the ice ages. Many of these cirques contain lakes, tarns of incredibly clear water fed by snowmelt and surrounded by walls of rock. The water in these lakes is cold year-round, rarely rising above 50 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer, and they support very little life. A few species of cold-adapted fish, some aquatic insects, colonies of algae clinging to rocks in the shallows. Above the lakes, chamois and ibex navigate cliffs that seem too steep for any animal to traverse, their hooves specially adapted for gripping on rock. Golden eagles nest on the highest ledges, raising chicks that will not leave the nest until they are nearly as large as their parents. We descend from the mountains and travel east along the Mediterranean coast, arriving in Carcassonne just after midnight. The medieval city sits on a hill above the Ode River, completely enclosed by 2 concentric walls studded with 53 towers. This is the largest fortified city in Europe, and from a distance, it looks like something from a fairy tale, turrets and battlements silhouetted against the night sky. The city has been continuously occupied for more than 2,000 years, first by Romans, then Visigoths, then various French rulers. The fortifications were expanded and improved over centuries, with the inner wall dating to the Gallo-Roman period and the outer wall added in the 13th century. During the Middle Ages, Carcassonne was considered nearly impregnable, protected by its double walls, its position on high ground, and its reliable water supply from wells dug deep into the bedrock. The city was besieged multiple times, but rarely taken by force. Eventually, as warfare evolved and cannons made stone walls less effective, Carcassonne's military importance diminished, and the city fell into disrepair. By the 19th century, many of the towers were in ruins, and there was serious discussion of demolishing the walls entirely. The city was saved by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, an architect who specialized in restoring medieval buildings. He spent more than 50 years working on Carcassonne, rebuilding towers, repairing walls, and replacing roofs. His restoration was controversial. He sometimes prioritized what he thought medieval architecture should look like over strict historical accuracy. The conical roofs on the towers, for instance, are Viollet-le-Duc's additions, modeled after medieval illustrations rather than archaeological evidence. Despite the controversies, his work saved the city from destruction, and today Carcassonne is remarkably well preserved. Walking through the narrow streets between the two walls, you can still see arrow slits in the towers, murder holes in gate passages, and sections of Roman masonry incorporated into later medieval construction. The streets are paved with round river stones set on edge, creating a surface that is uneven, but drains quickly when it rains. At night, with modern lighting carefully hidden, the city looks much as it might have looked 700 years ago. We continue along the coast toward Provence, entering a region defined by lavender fields and Roman ruins, and light that has attracted artists for centuries. The landscape changes subtly. The vegetation becomes more Mediterranean, with olive trees, cork oaks, and wild herbs like rosemary and thyme growing on hillsides. The air smells different here, drier, carrying scents of herbs and pine resin and the faint salt smell of the sea that is still miles away. The soil is rocky and poor, difficult for agriculture, but ideal for grapevines and lavender. Lavender has been cultivated in Provence since the Roman period, valued for its fragrance and its supposed medicinal properties. The plants are small, woody shrubs with narrow grey-green leaves and spikes of purple flowers that bloom in late June and July. The fields are planted in long rows that follow the contours of the hills, creating patterns visible from miles away. When the lavender is in bloom, the scent is overwhelming, so strong that it seems to have physical weight. Bees work the flowers constantly, and the honey they produce has a distinct lavender flavor. The train slows as it passes the Pont du Gard, a Roman aqueduct that spans the Garden River. The structure is nearly 2,000 years old, built around 50 CE to carry water from springs near Uzès to the Roman city of Nemausus, modern-day Nimes. The aqueduct bridge is 160 feet tall at its highest point and 900 feet long, constructed of limestone blocks that were quarried locally and fitted together without mortar. The blocks are held in place by their own weight and by the precision of the cutting. Each stone was shaped to fit exactly with its neighbors, creating a structure strong enough to stand for 2 millennia despite floods, earthquakes, and the passage of time. The aqueduct originally carried about 44 million gallons of water per day, flowing through a covered channel at the top of the bridge with a gradient of only 1 inch per every 300 feet. This required extraordinary precision in surveying and construction, as any significant deviation would either cause the water to overflow or slow to a trickle. The water flowed entirely by gravity, with no pumps or other mechanical aids, traveling about 30 miles from source to destination. The stones used to build the Pont du Gard show the marks of the tools that shaped them. Chisel cuts, drill holes where sections were split away, rough surfaces where the stone was left unfinished because it would not be visible once the structure was complete. The Roman builders used a technique called opus quadratum, stacking rectangular blocks in precise horizontal courses without mortar. Where extra strength was needed, They used iron clamps set into carved recesses and fixed with molten lead. Many of these clamps were stolen during the Middle Ages when iron was valuable, leaving scars in the stone. The aqueduct was used for about 400 to 500 years before maintenance stopped and calcium deposits from the water gradually clogged the channel. The bridge portion continued to be used for foot traffic, and in the Middle Ages, tolls were charged to cross it. The structure survived because it was useful, because it provided a reliable way to cross a river that could become impassable during floods. Standing beneath the arches, you can see how massive the blocks are. Some weigh 6 tons or more, and marvel at the logistics of lifting them into position using only human and animal power, wooden scaffolding, and rope. We travel south from the aqueduct toward Arles, a town that has been continuously inhabited for more than 2,000 years. The Romans built an arena here in 90 CE, an oval amphitheatre that could seat 20,000 spectators for gladiator contests, animal hunts, and executions. The arena is 440 feet long and 350 feet wide, with 2 tiers of 60 arches each, and an underground system of tunnels and chambers where gladiators and animals waited before being lifted to the arena floor on mechanical platforms. The arena fell into disuse after the fall of the Roman Empire and was gradually converted into a fortified town, with houses built into the arches and towers constructed on top of the outer walls. At one point, more than 200 dwellings were crammed inside the structure, along with a church and public squares. In the 19th century, the houses were demolished and the arena was restored to something approximating its original appearance. Today, it is still used for events, bullfights, concerts, reenactments, making it one of the oldest continuously used buildings in the world. The stone seats are worn smooth by centuries of use, and the arena floor, which was once sand covering the underground chambers, is now packed earth. Vincent van Gogh lived in Arles for 15 months in 1888 and 89, renting a small yellow house near the town square. He came to Provence seeking better light, warmer weather, and subjects that matched his artistic vision. In Arles, he painted some of his most famous works: sunflowers, the night cafe, the bedroom, the sower, the starry night over the Rhone River. He was fascinated by the quality of light in Provence, the way it seemed brighter and clearer than in the north, and he tried to capture this in his paintings using intense colors applied in thick brush strokes. He often painted outdoors, working quickly to catch the changing light, and his paintings from this period have an urgency and vitality that reflect his emotional state. Van Gogh struggled with mental illness during his time in Arles, and after a breakdown in which he cut off part of his own ear, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, about 15 miles away. The yellow house where he lived was destroyed by bombing during World War II, but the sites he painted, the cafe, the river, the hospital courtyard, still exist and are pilgrimage sites for admirers of his work. From Arles, we travel east along the coast toward Marseille, France's oldest city and its largest port. Marseille was founded around 600 BCE by Greek traders from Phocaea in what is now Turkey. They named it Massalia and built it into a major trading center, exporting wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods throughout the Mediterranean. The Greeks introduced the cultivation of grapes and olives to this part of France, plants that thrive in the Mediterranean climate with its hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. The old port of Marseille is shaped like a rectangle, about 1,000 feet long and 700 feet wide, surrounded by multi-story buildings painted in shades of ochre, cream, and pale pink. Fishing boats and pleasure craft fill the harbour, their masts creating a forest of vertical lines against the water. The morning fish market operates here every day, fishermen selling their catch directly from their boats: sea bass, red mullet, monkfish, octopus, shellfish, still alive and moving in baskets of seawater. The air smells of fish and salt, and the particular odor of seaweed drying in the sun. Above the old port, on a limestone hill, stands Notre Dame de la Garde, a basilica built in the 1860s in a Romano-Byzantine style. The church is topped with a golden statue of the Virgin Mary and Child, 60 feet tall and visible from everywhere in the city and far out to sea. The statue serves as a beacon for sailors, and the basilica is filled with ex votos offerings left by people whose prayers were answered. Many are model ships, ranging from simple wooden carvings to elaborate scale models complete with rigging and sails, left by sailors who survived storms or fishermen who returned safely from dangerous waters. Others are paintings depicting maritime disasters, ships sinking, men drowning, storms destroying entire fleets, with inscriptions thanking the Virgin for miraculous rescues. The basilica interior is decorated with alternating bands of white and colored marble, creating horizontal stripes that make the walls seem to vibrate in the light from the candles and windows. The ceiling is covered with mosaics depicting biblical scenes and the history of Marseille, all rendered in tiny tiles of colored glass and gold leaf. The floor is made of marble, worn smooth in places by the feet of millions of pilgrims and visitors. The coast east of Marseille is cut by calanques, steep-walled inlets, where the limestone cliffs meet the Mediterranean. The water in the calanques is extraordinarily clear, ranging from pale turquoise in the shallows to deep blue in the depths, and the bottom is visible even at depths of 60 or 70 feet. The cliffs are white limestone, eroded into dramatic shapes by wind and water, and they support a specialized vegetation adapted to the harsh conditions, low scrubby plants, with small leaves and deep roots that can find water in cracks in the rock. Rosemary, thyme, and sage grow wild here, releasing their scents when the sun heats the leaves. The calanques were formed millions of years ago when the sea level was lower and rivers cut valleys into the limestone. As the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose and flooded these valleys, creating the landscape we see today. The largest calanques are accessible by boat, but many smaller ones can only be reached by hiking along narrow paths that cling to the cliff sides, sometimes requiring scrambling over rocks or using fixed chains for support. The paths are marked with cairns and paint blazes, but they are not maintained, and sections are sometimes washed away by storms. We continue east along the coast, passing through Cannes and Antibes, arriving at Nice as the sun begins to set. Nice sits in a bay protected by hills, and its Promenade des Anglais runs along the waterfront for 4 miles, a wide walkway paved with stone and lined with palm trees and Belle Époque buildings painted in shades of cream, yellow and pale terracotta. The promenade was built in the 1820s, funded by the English aristocrats who spent their winters in Nice to escape the cold and damp of London. They hired unemployed locals to construct the walkway, providing both employment and a pleasant place to stroll. The beach at Nice is not sand, but Galette's smooth oval stones, ranging from the size of golf balls to the size of small melons. Walking on them is difficult, as they shift underfoot, but the stones create a distinctive sound when waves wash over them, a rattling chorus that can be heard all along the waterfront. The stones are mostly limestone and quartz, worn smooth by centuries of wave action, and they are warm to the touch in summer after absorbing heat from the sun all day. The water is remarkably clear, and even from the promenade, you can see fish swimming near the shore, small silvery fish that move in schools, changing direction in unison as though controlled by a single mind. The hills behind Nice are terraced with olive groves, some of which have been producing olives for hundreds of years. The olive trees themselves can live for 1,000 years or more, growing slowly, their trunks becoming gnarled and twisted with age. The oldest trees are hollow, their centers rotted away, but they continue to produce leaves and fruit from the living wood at the edges. Olives are harvested in late autumn and winter, when they have turned from green to purple to black. They are too bitter to eat directly from the tree. They must be cured in brine or oil to break down the oleuropein, a compound that makes them unpalatable. After curing, the olives are either eaten whole or pressed for oil. Traditional olive mills use massive granite millstones that rotate in a circular trough, crushing the olives into a paste. The paste is spread on circular mats made of woven plant fibers, and the mats are stacked and pressed. Oil and water seep out and are separated. The oil floats to the top and is skimmed off. The first pressing produces the highest quality oil, called extra virgin, with low acidity and complex flavor. Subsequent pressings produce lesser grades. From Nice, we travel to Monaco, a tiny principality squeezed between the mountains and the sea. The entire country is less than 1 square mile in area, making it the second smallest nation in the world after Vatican City. Monaco is built on a rocky promontory and extends up the steep hillside behind it, with buildings stacked vertically to maximize the limited space. The palace of the ruling Grimaldi family sits at the highest point of the old town, a fortified structure that has been expanded and modified over 7 centuries. Parts of the palace date to the 13th century, when the Grimaldi family first took control of the rock, disguising themselves as monks to gain entry to the fortress. The palace now contains more than 200 rooms, though only a portion is open to visitors. The state apartments are decorated with frescoes and gold leaf and furniture from various periods, and they overlook a courtyard paved with 3 million small coloured stones arranged in geometric patterns. The stones are smooth river pebbles, collected from beaches and riverbeds, and set on edge in mortar, a technique called calade that requires extraordinary patience and skill. Monaco is famous for its casino, a Belle Époque building designed by Charles Garnier, the same architect who designed the Paris Opera House. The casino opened in 1863 and immediately became fashionable with European aristocracy. The exterior is ornate columns, statues, bas-reliefs, and the interior is even more elaborate, with gaming rooms decorated in different styles. The Salon Rose is pink and gold. The Salon Renaissance has carved wood ceilings and tapestries, and the Salle Garnier is an opera house decorated with paintings and sculptures commissioned specifically for the building. The casino is built at the edge of a cliff, and from its terrace you can see the harbour below filled with yachts that range from modest sailboats to multi-deck vessels longer than football fields. The casino's income has historically funded much of Monaco's government budget, allowing the principality to avoid income taxes for its residents. The gaming tables are covered with green felt, the roulette wheels are mahogany and brass, and the dealers wear formal attire even in the middle of summer. The rooms smell of old wood and carpet, and the particular mixture of perfumes and colognes worn by the wealthy. We board the train again as night deepens, leaving Monaco behind and travelling north toward the Alps. The train climbs steadily, following valleys that cut into the mountains, crossing bridges that span gorges hundreds of feet deep. The Alps are young mountains, geologically speaking, formed by the collision of the African and European tectonic plates, beginning about 65 million years ago. The collision continues today, pushing the mountains upward by about 1 millimeter per year, though erosion wears them down almost as fast. The highest peak entirely within France is Mont Blanc, which reaches 15,774 feet, though the exact height changes slightly each year as snow and ice accumulate on the summit or are blown away by wind. The mountains are covered with glaciers, rivers of ice that flow downhill under their own weight, carving U-shaped valleys and depositing moraines piles of rock and gravel at their lower edges. The train passes through tunnels blasted through solid rock, emerging occasionally to views of peaks illuminated by moonlight, their snow-covered slopes glowing pale blue against the dark sky. We arrive at Chamonix, a valley town at the base of Mont Blanc, surrounded on all sides by mountains. The valley was first settled in the 11th century by monks who came to clear forest and establish farms in the high pastures. For centuries, the valley was isolated, accessible only by narrow mountain paths that were impassable in winter when snow blocked the passes. The first tourists arrived in the 18th century, drawn by accounts of the dramatic scenery and the novelty of seeing glaciers at close range. These early visitors were often scientists and artists who came to study or paint the mountains. The first ascent of Mont Blanc was made in 1786 by Jacques Balmat and Michel Gabriel Picard, who climbed from Chamonix to the summit and back in a single day. A feat that required extraordinary endurance and skill given the equipment available at the time. Today, thousands of people attempt the climb each year, though it remains dangerous. Altitude sickness, avalanches, crevasses, sudden storms, and freezing temperatures claim lives every season. The Mer de Glace, the Sea of Ice, is the largest glacier in France, stretching for nearly 4.5 miles down the northern slope of Mont Blanc. The glacier is a river of ice, flowing downhill at a rate of about 3 feet per day in summer, when melting lubricates its base, slower in winter when it is frozen solid. The ice is compressed snow, accumulated over decades or centuries, and it is intensely blue where it is exposed. The ice absorbs red and yellow wavelengths of light and reflects blue, creating a color that seems almost artificial in its intensity. The glacier is accessed by a cable car and then a series of metal staircases that descend to an ice grotto carved into the glacier's side. The grotto is rechiseled every year because the glacier's movement and the melting of its surface continually change its shape. Inside, the walls are solid ice, and the temperature is below freezing even in summer. The ice is remarkably clear in some places, allowing you to see air bubbles trapped centuries ago, and opaque in others where the pressure has crushed the crystals into a dense, white mass. From Chamonix, we travel west across the Rhône Valley toward Lyon, descending from the high Alps into lower, more populated terrain. Lyon sits at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, a location that has made it a strategic and commercial center for more than 2,000 years. The Romans built their regional capital here, constructing an amphitheater, aqueducts, and temples. Some of these structures still stand, particularly on Fourvière Hill, where the ancient theatre has been excavated and restored and is now used for concerts and festivals. The old city, Vieux-Lyon, sits at the base of the hill along the Saône River, a network of narrow streets lined with Renaissance buildings painted in shades of ochre, salmon, and cream. These buildings are 5 and 6 stories tall, with stone facades on the ground floor and plaster on the upper floors, supported by wooden beams. Many contain trabbles, covered passageways that connect one street to another through the interior of the buildings, originally created to allow silk workers to transport their goods while protecting them from rain. Lyon became the center of French silk production in the 16th century, when King Francis I established workshops in the city. Silk thread was imported from Italy and later from China, and Lyon's weavers transformed it into fabric using jacquard looms, complex machines that used punched cards to control the pattern being woven. The development of the jacquard loom in 1804 was a breakthrough. It allowed weavers to create intricate patterns that previously would have required multiple workers and days of labor. The looms were large, filling entire rooms, and the sound they made was distinctive, a rhythmic clacking as the shuttle passed back and forth through the threads, combined with the softer whisper of cards being read and the mechanism shifting to create the next row of the pattern. The silk workers, called canuts, often lived in the upper floors of buildings where high ceilings could accommodate the tall looms and large windows provided the light needed for detailed work. The fabric they produced was sold throughout Europe. Brocades, damasks, velvets used for clothing, upholstery, and church vestments. The cuisine of Lyon is considered some of the finest in France, characterized by rich, hearty dishes that make use of local ingredients: pork, chicken, freshwater fish, cream, butter, wine. The city has more restaurants per capita than anywhere else in France, including many traditional bouchons, small restaurants that serve classic Lyonnaise dishes in casual settings. The food is unfussy, but requires skill quenelles, delicate dumplings made from pike or chicken and poached in cream sauce, coq au vin, chicken braised in red wine with mushrooms and onions, saucisson, dry cured sausages served with bread and cornichons. The covered food market, Les Halles de Lyon Paul Bocuse, is a cathedral of gastronomy, a building filled with vendors selling cheese, charcuterie, seafood, produce, pastries, chocolate, and wine. The cheese section alone contains hundreds of varieties, soft, bloomy rind cheeses like Camembert and Brie, firm cheeses like Comté and Beaufort, blue cheeses like Roquefort and Bleu d'Auvergne. Each cheese has its own aroma, texture, and flavor profile, developed through specific techniques of production and aging. We leave Lyon and travel northeast toward the Jura Mountains, a range of limestone peaks and forested plateaus that form the border between France and Switzerland. The landscape here is characterized by cliffs, caves, waterfalls, and deep valleys carved by rivers that disappear underground and emerge miles away from springs in the rock. The Jura is famous for its Comté cheese, a hard cheese made from the milk of Montbéliard cows that graze in high mountain pastures. The cheese is produced in fruitières, cooperative dairies, where milk from multiple farms is pooled and transformed into enormous wheels weighing about 88 pounds each. The milk is heated in copper vats, rennet is added to cause it to coagulate, and the curds are cut into small pieces and stirred. The curds are pressed into molds and then aged in cellars for a minimum of 4 months, though the best Comté is aged for 18 months or longer. During aging, the wheels are turned and washed regularly, and they develop a natural rind and complex flavors: nutty, fruity, sometimes with hints of caramel or roasted nuts. The forests of the Jura are dominated by spruce and fir trees, conifers that thrive in the cool, moist climate. These forests have been managed for centuries, harvested for timber, used in construction, and, most famously, in the making of musical instruments. The wood from Jura spruce is particularly prized for violins and other stringed instruments. Because of its acoustic properties, it is light, strong, and resonant, capable of vibrating freely without damping the sound. The tree must be at least 150 years old before the wood is suitable, and even then, only certain sections of the trunk are used. The wood is split, never sawed, to preserve the natural alignment of the fibers, and it is aged for several years before being carved into the thin plates that form the top and back of a violin. The skill required to make a fine violin is extraordinary. The plates must be carved to precise thicknesses that vary across their surface. The bass bar and sound post must be positioned exactly, and the varnish must protect the wood without deadening its resonance. The great violin makers of Cremona, Italy, used wood from these forests, and modern luthiers continue to seek out Jura spruce for their instruments. We descend from the Jura toward Dijon, the historic capital of Burgundy, a city that was once the seat of powerful dukes who ruled a territory that included much of eastern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The palace of the Dukes of Burgundy dominates the city centre, a complex of buildings surrounding a courtyard, with a tower that rises more than 150 feet. The palace is built from pale limestone that glows golden in late afternoon light, and its roof is covered with glazed tiles arranged in geometric patterns of green, yellow, black, and red, the same style that would later be used at the Hospices de Beaune. Inside, the palace contains a museum with an extraordinary collection of medieval and Renaissance art, including the tombs of the dukes. Elaborate sculptures that show the deceased lying in state surrounded by mourners, carved in such detail that you can see the folds of their robes and the expressions on their faces. The mourners are life-sized figures, each one unique, some weeping, some praying, some lost in thought. Dijon is famous for its mustard, a condiment made from brown mustard seeds, vinegar, and white wine. The seeds are ground into a paste and mixed with the liquid, creating a sharp, pungent flavor that ranges from mildly spicy to intensely hot, depending on the variety of seed and the proportions used. Dijon mustard has been produced in the city since the 13th century, though the modern recipe was developed in 1856 when Jean Naigeon replaced the traditional vinegar with verjuice, the acidic juice of unripe grapes. This created a smoother, less harsh flavor that became the standard for Dijon mustard. The mustard is sold in small earthenware pots or glass jars, and it is used in French cooking both as a condiment and as an ingredient in sauces: mustard cream sauce for rabbit, mustard vinaigrette for salad, mustard glaze for ham. The seed itself comes from the mustard plant, a member of the brassica family that also includes cabbage, broccoli, and turnips. The plant produces bright yellow flowers in spring, and fields of flowering mustard are a common sight in Burgundy in May and June. The train carries us north toward the Champagne region, the landscape gradually flattening as we leave the hills of Burgundy behind. We pass through Troyes, a medieval city that was once a major trading centre, hosting annual fairs that attracted merchants from across Europe. The old city centre is shaped like a champagne cork, a detail that locals point out with pride, and it is filled with half-timbered houses that lean at precarious angles, their upper floors jutting out over the narrow streets. Many of these houses date from the 16th century, built after a fire destroyed much of the medieval city. The timber frames are made from oak, and the spaces between the beams are filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and horsehair that has hardened over the centuries into a substance nearly as durable as concrete. The houses were originally plastered and whitewashed, but many have been restored to show the timber framework, creating the distinctive pattern of dark wood against pale walls. The streets are paved with cobblestones, and in the oldest parts of the city, the stones are so worn that they are smooth and slippery when wet. North of Troyes, we enter the Argonne Forest, a region of low hills and dense woodland that has been the site of numerous battles throughout French history. The forest provided cover and concealment, making it ideal for defensive positions and ambushes. During World War I, the Argonne was heavily fought over, and the landscape still bears scars. The ground is pocked with craters from artillery shells, and in some areas, the soil contains so much metal that nothing will grow. The forest has recovered remarkably well, however, and today it is a quiet place, home to deer, wild boar, foxes, and numerous species of birds. The trees are mostly oak and beech, with some pine planted in areas that were too badly damaged to regenerate naturally. The forest floor is carpeted with ferns and moss, and in spring, wildflowers bloom in the clearings: bluebells, primroses, wood anemones. The light that filters through the canopy is green-tinted, and the air smells of earth and decomposing leaves, and the faint resin scent of pine. We arrive at the Cathedral of Reims again, approaching from a different angle this time, and notice details that were invisible before. The western facade is covered with more than 2,300 statues, each one carved with individual features and expressions. The central portal depicts the Last Judgment, with Christ seated in judgment above the doorway and souls being separated into the saved and the damned below. The saved are shown being led by angels toward the gates of heaven, their faces serene and joyful. The damned are being dragged by demons toward the mouth of hell, depicted as a monstrous head with gaping jaws. The sculptures were originally painted in bright colors, red, blue, gold, green, though the paint has long since weathered away, leaving only traces in the deep recesses where rain could not reach. The stone itself has aged to a pale grey, almost white in places, and it is soft enough that you can see the marks of the chisels that shaped it more than 700 years ago. Some of the faces have been worn smooth by centuries of weather, but others remain remarkably detailed. The train turns west, following the Marne River toward Paris, arriving at the city from a different direction than we left it. We cross the river on a stone bridge and enter the Marais district, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Paris, characterized by narrow streets and buildings from the 17th and 18th centuries. The Marais was originally marshland. Its name means marsh that was drained in the Middle Ages and developed into one of the most fashionable areas of the city. Aristocrats built large townhouses called hotels particuliers, mansions arranged around interior courtyards, with grand facades facing the street and private gardens behind. Many of these buildings have been converted into museums, shops, and apartments, but they retain their original architecture, carved stone doorways, wrought iron balconies, slate roofs with multiple chimneys. The streets are lined with plane trees whose bark peels away in irregular patches, creating mottled patterns of cream, grey, and brown. The sidewalks are narrow, forcing pedestrians to walk in single file or step into the street when passing one another. We find ourselves at the Place des Vosges, the oldest planned square in Paris, completed in 1612. The square is perfectly symmetrical, surrounded on all sides by matching buildings of red brick and pale stone, each 3 stories tall, with arcaded walkways at ground level. The center of the square is a garden with gravel paths, lawns, and rows of linden trees that provide shade in summer and turn golden in autumn. Fountains occupy the 4 corners of the garden, simple stone basins where water bubbles up and spills over the edges with a sound like continuous rain. The square was built on the site of a former royal palace, and it was designed to provide residences for wealthy families, while creating a public space for leisure and social gathering. Victor Hugo lived in an apartment on the southeast corner from 1832 to 1848, and his residence is now a museum containing his furniture, manuscripts, and personal effects. The windows of his apartment overlook the square, and you can imagine him sitting at his desk, writing by candlelight or lamplight, occasionally glancing out at the people walking below. From the Marais, we walk south across the Aile de la Cité toward the Latin Quarter, crossing the bridge near the Conciergerie, a medieval palace that became a prison during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was held here before her execution, in a cell that has been preserved and is now part of the building's museum. The cell is small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with stone walls and a vaulted ceiling. It contains a bed, a chair, and a small table, all reproductions of the original furniture. The floor is flagstone, worn smooth and slightly concave in places from centuries of footsteps. The window is small and high, fitted with iron bars, and it looks out onto a courtyard where prisoners took their daily exercise. The building also contains the Salle des Gendarmes, a vast Gothic hall with 4 rows of columns supporting a vaulted ceiling. This hall served as a dining room for the palace guards and servants, and it could accommodate hundreds of people at long tables. The space is cold, even in summer, and sound echoes off the stone walls in a way that makes whispered conversations audible from far away. We cross to the left bank and enter the Jardin de Luxembourg, a park created in 1612 by Marie de Medici, who wanted gardens that reminded her of her childhood in Florence. The park covers 56 acres and includes formal French gardens with geometric flower beds, tree-lined promenades, fountains, and a large octagonal pond where children sail toy boats. The pond is surrounded by metal chairs, and people sit reading or watching the boats drift across the water, pushed by the wind or by the long sticks that children use to guide them. The Luxembourg Palace sits at the northern end of the park, a building that now houses the French Senate, but was originally built as a residence for Marie de Medici. The palace is constructed of stone from different quarries, creating subtle variations in colour. Some blocks are pale grey, others cream, some with a faint pinkish tinge. The park is planted with dozens of varieties of apples and pears, trained as espaliers against metal frames. Their branches spread horizontally to maximize fruit production and create decorative patterns. In autumn, the fruit hangs heavy on the branches, and the park staff harvests it to make jam and cider. We leave the park and walk east toward the Panthéon, a massive domed building that sits on the highest point of the left bank. The Panthéon was originally built as a church dedicated to Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, but during the Revolution, it was converted into a secular mausoleum for distinguished French citizens. The interior is vast and austere, with minimal decoration compared to churches of similar size. The walls are marble, and the floor is flagstone arranged in geometric patterns. The dome rises 330 feet above the floor, supported by 4 massive piers at the corners of a square crossing. Foucault's pendulum hangs from the center of the dome, a 220-pound brass sphere on a 220-foot wire that swings back and forth, demonstrating the rotation of the Earth. As the Earth rotates beneath the pendulum, the plane of the pendulum's swing appears to rotate, knocking over markers arranged in a circle on the floor. The crypt beneath the Panthéon contains the tombs of more than 70 notable individuals: Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, Émile Zola, Marie Curie, Alexandre Dumas. From the Panthéon, we descend toward the Seine, walking through the ancient streets of the Latin Quarter, where universities have operated for more than 800 years. The Sorbonne, one of the oldest universities in the world, was founded in 1257 as a theology college and gradually expanded to include all areas of study. The buildings are scattered throughout the neighborhood, some medieval, some more recent, all built from the same pale limestone that characterizes so much of Paris. Students have walked these streets for centuries, and the area retains an academic atmosphere. Bookshops, cafes, where philosophers and writers once gathered, lecture halls, where ideas that would change the world were first articulated. The streets here are among the narrowest in Paris, some barely wide enough for a single car, and they follow the medieval street plan rather than the wide boulevards that Baron Haussmann imposed on much of the city. The buildings are tall, creating canyon-like spaces where sunlight reaches the pavement only briefly at midday. We walk along the Rue Mouffetard, one of the oldest streets in Paris, following a route that was originally a Roman road leading south from the city. The street climbs a gentle hill, lined with shops, cafes, and market stalls selling produce, cheese, bread, flowers, and prepared foods. The market operates every day except Monday, and it has functioned continuously on this street for hundreds of years, though the products have changed, no longer live chickens and rabbits, but still fresh vegetables brought from farms within 100 miles of the city, fish from the coast, cheese from regions throughout France. The buildings along the street are 4 and 5 stories tall, their ground floors occupied by shops, the upper floors by apartments with shuttered windows and small balconies holding flower boxes or bicycles. The street is cobblestoned, and the stones are worn into smooth depressions where carts and wagons travelled for centuries. At the bottom of the hill, the street opens onto a small square with a fountain, and from there, paths lead into the Jardin des Plantes. The Jardin des Plantes is a botanical garden covering 69 acres, first created in 1635 as a medicinal plant garden for King Louis XIII. The garden contains more than 10,000 species of plants arranged in themed sections: alpine gardens, rose gardens, beds of perennials, greenhouses containing tropical and desert species. The oldest tree in Paris stands here, a false acacia planted in 1636, its trunk thick and gnarled, supported by metal braces to prevent the weight of its branches from splitting the wood. The tree still produces leaves and flowers each spring, delicate white blossoms that hang in clusters and fill the air with a sweet scent. The garden also contains the National Museum of Natural History, a collection of buildings housing specimens from all branches of natural science: mineralogy, paleontology, zoology, botany. The Gallery of Evolution displays taxidermied animals arranged as though traveling across the savannah or through the jungle: elephants, giraffes, lions, zebras, all carefully preserved and positioned to suggest movement and life. We cross the river one final time, returning to the right bank, and walk through the Tuileries Garden, a formal garden stretching from the Louvre to the Place de la Concorde. The garden was created in 1564 by Catherine de' Medici, who wanted an Italian-style garden adjacent to her palace. The palace no longer exists. It was destroyed during the Paris Commune in 1871, but the garden remains, redesigned in the 17th century by André Le Nôtre in the same formal style he used at Versailles. The garden is arranged symmetrically along a central axis, with gravel paths, rectangular pools, and rows of carefully pruned trees. Statues are positioned at regular intervals: classical figures in white marble or bronze gods, goddesses, allegorical representations of virtues and seasons. The gravel is raked smooth each morning, and the paths are bordered by low hedges trimmed into precise geometric shapes. In summer, the chairs that line the paths are filled with people reading or resting, and children sail boats in the round pond near the western end of the garden. At the western end of the Tuileries, we enter the Place de la Concorde, the largest square in Paris, covering more than 21 acres. At its center stands an obelisk from Lascaux, Egypt, a granite monument covered with hieroglyphics, 3,300 years old, given to France by Egypt in 1833. The obelisk is 75 feet tall and weighs 250 tons, and transporting it from Egypt to Paris required building a special ship and navigating it up the Seine to this spot. The base of the obelisk shows engravings depicting its transportation and erection. The square itself was built in the 18th century and was originally called Place Louis XV, with an equestrian statue of King Louis XV at its center. During the Revolution, the statue was destroyed and the square was renamed Place de la Révolution. The guillotine was erected here, and more than 1,200 people were executed on this spot, including King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre. After the Revolution, the square was renamed Place de la Concorde in an attempt to symbolize reconciliation. From the Place de la Concorde, we can see the Arc de Triomphe at the far end of the Champs-Élysées, and we begin the long walk up the avenue toward it. The Champs-Élysées stretches for about 1¼ miles, rising gradually from the Place de la Concorde to the Place Charles de Gaulle, where the Arc de Triomphe stands. The avenue is lined with chestnut trees, and in spring, these trees produce candles of white flowers that perfume the air. The sidewalks are wide, broader than many streets, and they are filled with cafes, shops, cinemas, and banks, their windows glowing with light. The Arc de Triomphe grows larger as we approach, its massive stone form becoming more detailed. The monument was commissioned by Napoleon in 1806 to honor the French army, but it was not completed until 1836, long after his death. The arch is 164 feet tall and 148 feet wide, built from limestone and decorated with enormous sculptures depicting military victories and allegorical figures representing peace, resistance, and victory. The names of generals and battles are carved into the stone, hundreds of them, a record of wars fought across Europe and beyond. We pass beneath the Arc de Triomphe and find our train waiting on the far side, steam rising from its engine into the cold night air. The tomb of the unknown soldier lies directly beneath the arch, a flat stone marker with an eternal flame that has burned continuously since 1923, rekindled every evening at 6:30 in a brief ceremony. The flame commemorates soldiers who died in war without being identified, their bodies returned home, but their names lost. The stone is simple, inscribed with the words "Ici repose un soldat français mort pour la patrie." Here rests a French soldier who died for his country. Wreaths of flowers surround the flame left by visiting dignitaries and ordinary citizens, and the stone is worn smooth from the feet of those who pause to pay respects. 12 avenues radiate from the Place Charles de Gaulle like spokes from a wheel, each named after a French military victory or leader, and traffic flows around the arch in a continuous circle with no lane markings. A system that somehow works despite appearing chaotic. We walk one more time along the Seine as dawn begins to break, the sky lightening from black to navy to a pale grey that makes the river's surface look like brushed steel. The bouquinistes are beginning to set up their stalls, opening the green wooden boxes that line the river wall and arranging their wares: old books, vintage magazines, posters, postcards, prints. These sellers have operated along the Seine for more than 400 years, and their boxes are a permanent part of the river's landscape. Each bouquiniste has a designated section of wall, passed down through families or sold to new owners, and the right to operate a stall is protected by tradition and law. The books they sell are often old and worn, pages yellowed and spines cracked, but occasionally a treasure appears: a first edition, a signed copy, a manuscript letter tucked between pages and forgotten for decades. The sellers know their stock intimately, and they can tell you the history of almost any item, where it came from, who might have owned it, why it matters, or why it does not. The air smells of river water and old paper, and the particular scent of Paris in the early morning, a combination of damp stone and baking bread and coffee from cafes beginning to open. Our final stop is Père Lachaise Cemetery, the largest cemetery in Paris, covering 110 acres on a hillside in the 20th arrondissement. The cemetery was opened in 1804 and designed to resemble an English garden rather than a traditional French cemetery, with winding paths, trees, and elaborate tombs that range from simple headstones to massive mausoleums decorated with sculptures and architectural details. More than 1 million people are buried here, including many famous individuals: Chopin, Molière, Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, Jim Morrison. The tomb of Oscar Wilde is covered with lipstick kisses, left by admirers who press their lips against the stone despite barriers erected to protect the monument from damage. The tomb of Jim Morrison is surrounded by graffiti and offerings: flowers, candles, bottles of wine, handwritten notes. The oldest graves date to the early 19th century, and many are overgrown with ivy and moss, the inscriptions weathered to illegibility. The paths are cobblestoned and lined with chestnut trees, whose roots have pushed up the stones in places, creating an uneven surface. The cemetery is quiet, except for birdsong and the crunch of gravel underfoot, and the morning light filters through the trees in shafts that illuminate particles of dust and pollen floating in the air. The journey through France is complete. We have traveled from Paris to the coast, from mountains to vineyards, from ancient caves to medieval cities, from Roman ruins to Renaissance chateaux. We have walked empty streets and climbed worn steps, touched stones carved 1,000 years ago, and stood in places where history happened. The train begins to move one last time, slowly at first, then gathering speed as it carries us away from Paris, out into the darkness where the journey continues, or perhaps ends, depending on how you choose to see it. The compartment is warm, the seats are comfortable, and through the window, France disappears into the distance, a collection of lights that grow smaller and then vanish entirely, leaving only the darkness and the steady rhythm of wheels on rails, a sound like breathing, like a heartbeat, like sleep approaching step by step by step. Rest now. The journey is over. Dawn is coming, but for now, let the darkness hold you. Let the movement of the train rock you. Let the memories of France drift through your mind, like dreams already half forgotten, beautiful and distant and safe,